So welcome everyone. It's great to see such a strong crowd here today. We're really looking forward to this conversation. And I should say, you all are being super quiet right now, which is perfect. There are no microphones in this room, so if you can try to just do your best to hear what we're chatting about, that'll help us to project what we're saying. There are very good acoustics, I'll say that. So my name's Amanda Swar. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. And I should mention too that we're recording this conversation today. The recording is not including anyone in the room, but we're going to be transcribing the discussion and hopefully actually featuring the conversation in the journal GLQ. So we're looking forward to being able to share the conversation that we're having today more widely. If you have any concerns, and I'm going to turn off the camera before we get to the Q&A part, so if you have any concerns about being recording or about the recording, feel free to talk to me or to the other faculty from Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies who are here with you. So let's get started. It's such a pleasure to welcome three incredible panelists here for an event that we're calling Toward Intersex Futures, a panel discussion on power and politics beyond the binary. The event today is organized by the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies and has many co-sponsors, and I think the range of units that are co-sponsoring this conversation will really give you a sense of the importance of these speakers' work. The event is co-sponsored by the Q Center, the Department of American Ethnic Studies, the Department of Law, Societies, and Justice, and the Simpson Center for the Humanities, as well as the Earl and Edna Lectureship in the Social Sciences and the Mellon Foundation. So we're really excited to be partnering with all these units and really for the opportunity to foreground intersex futures here today. So let me tell you a little bit about the amazing speakers who we have with us. Emi Koyama, who's here with Kitty, is a multi-issue social justice activist and writer, synthesizing feminist, Asian, survivor, dyke, queer, sex worker, intersex, genderqueer, and crip politics. These factors, while not a complete descriptor of who she is, all impacted her life. Emi is putting the Emmy back in feminism and has an amazing website called, you can check it out, www.eminism.org. And please do check out this website. I think it's self-coded. It's a kind of work of art, the site itself, and has a wealth of information including writings, resources, and more. And to say that Emi is legendary is really an understatement. She's written foundational works for our field of gender, women, and sexuality studies and beyond, perhaps most notably the Trans Feminist Manifesto, written in 2000, which has been republished countless times. She's been a tireless advocate for the decriminalization of sex work, and as we were reminded yesterday at the lecture, for those of you who were able to be with us, co-founded Intersex Awareness Day in 2003. So we're honored to have Emi with us here today. Our second panelist in the middle is Amanda Sáenz, who is another amazing person to have with us on this panel. Amanda is a queer Latin American immigrant and intersex advocate based in Seattle. They're a member of the Intersex Research Coalition, an emerging group of providers and intersex professionals working to advance health and social equity for intersex persons, and a former board member of InterConnect, the largest intersex support group here in the United States. I want to mention that Amanda also has ties to our campus community as a recent UW graduate with a Master's of Public Administration, and their recent work focuses on educating medical students on intersex justice issues, ensuring the fair implementation of community-led research practices, and forming channels for intersex-inclusive policy initiatives. And Amanda is an incredible thinker and scholar, as well as a policy expert and strategist, and I'm so excited for all of you to hear about their work here today. Last but not least, to my right, is Saifa, who describes himself as a Black, queer, intersex activist and rising scholar. Many of you had an opportunity yesterday to be at Dr. Wall's lecture. He has an impressive record of scholarship and interventions into intersex medicine. Saifa was a prestigious Marie, I can never quite say this, Sklodowska Sklodowska, thank you, Curie Fellow at the University of Huddersfield, where he earned his doctorate in sociology. He's written numerous articles and a book that he co-authored titled Intersex, Variations of Sex Characteristics, DSD, Critical Approaches, was just published with Routledge at the end of 2024. He's co-founder of the Intersex Justice Project, an initiative by intersex people of color to challenge medically unnecessary surgeries on intersex children and young adults. He's also been featured in national and international media regularly over the past 2 decades, including, well, more than 2 decades now, including NPR, Scientific American, The Guardian, ABC, NBC, the list goes on, and was featured in the documentary film Everybody. So to say this is an impressive panel is really an understatement. And before we begin, I want to give you a little window into the collective process that the 4 of us engaged in thinking about this panel discussion and what to approach and share with you today. So we created a couple of Google Docs. We brainstormed there. We had ideas. We had a really rich Zoom discussion among the 4 of us. And the panelists really thought together about what topics to center with you today. I also want to say from the offset that we were all very clear, and the panelists were very clear, this is not intended as an Intersex 101 panel. We're really interested in moving the discussion beyond an introduction to intersex to centering important and complex conversations that they've been engaged in for many years. So, bless you.
Thank you.
So we're excited about that. So to start us off, part of what the panelists discussed today when we were conceptualizing the panel is how all 3 of you have been involved with intersex politics over so many years, and that you're all pioneers in your own right who represent different generations. And your work represents a trajectory of intersex activism over so many decades. So I thought maybe we could start off having you talk a little bit about the work you've been doing, your investments over the years. You all have these kinds of amazing political commitments. So could you share some of what stands out the most to you in your eyes? What have been some of the most significant kind of moments in this kind of bigger trajectory that you've been part of?
So I'm not really loud, so I try to, but if you can't hear me, just do something so that, Okay, great, thank you. So I got involved with the Intersex Society in North America around like 2000, 1999, 2000. This is before social media, how many were like not born? Yeah. So yeah, it's just so crazy. Everybody is like born after 9/11 these days, Anyway, I was like, I was young, and I was, for the first time I applied to be like an intern with the Intersex Society in North America. That show Chase founded in 1993, and there was some earlier generation who were getting together and talking to each other for the first time. And before the time, nobody has met any other intersex people. So this was really significant. It was before social media, like I said. Around that time, I remember people started blogging, but they called it weblog. So, and just a very, very early part of internet, people were connecting on the internet, and so it was just so hard to connect with other people. And so for me, if I go work at Intersex North America, I'll get to meet all the people, and all the people who are out and who are also connected through the organization. So that's how I connected. And then I was really active for a few years after that. Just really seeing how the intersex activists have started to have influence in medicine, getting some of the allies within the medical field, having some of the opinions actually heard, as opposed to before that doctors would basically just reject us without even like hearing what we're actually saying. So the doctors thought like we want to create the third gender categories, etc. And that wasn't really a priority, but that's what they thought that we were doing. And then they were like, no, that's gonna scare all the parents, blah blah blah. Anyway, so I was in that point, and also that's a time that they started creating new medical terms, like the DSD, disorder of sex development, and which was actually briefly disorder of sex differentiation and development, and that was like replacing the older terms like hermaphroditism and intersex. And the people were saying like, oh, like this word intersex is disappearing. They're taking it away from us. But then at the time I saw that by it becoming like faded out from the medical community, maybe it's time for people to just actually be able to take it and make it like, you know, make it their own thing as opposed to something the medical community labeled them. Also around the same time, we started seeing some of the children being raised with full knowledge of their body, some, you know, less medical intervention, the things that people didn't need were happening, even though the change was happening really slowly, but we started to see some of the parents who are hearing from us and just started to change how they treat their children. Some people in the medical community either started changing because they changed their mind or because they started to be worried about being sued by us. And then, you know, so they started to see that. And then, you know, at the time it was unimaginable what the future intersex community would be like if people actually grew up knowing that they were intersex, if people grew up without having like, you know, all kinds of like you know, extreme medical interventions and shaming and secrecy surrounding it. And, you know, it's slower than we want it, but I think it's happening. So that's like kind of major shift in to me from the time that I was most active in doing intersex work versus compared to like how it's coming now. And of course people are connecting much easier because of social media and everything, and some of that is really horrible, but you know, some of the good things are happening. So yeah.
Yeah, I want to sort of take up where you left off, Emi, because I was on the call, you know, we talked about how it's like, how would you talk about generations, you know what I'm saying? Like, because I feel like, I remember you, Emi, I think it was at the 2004 Insight Women of Color Conference in Chicago, and you were on a panel about feminism and sex work and disability. We also talked on a call about how in 2004, also when I was working at the Gay Straight Alliance Network in California, how we did like a little action at the American Urological Association conference. It was at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. We were handing out like flyers. I'm like, man, that was like 20 fucking years ago, Jesus Christ. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, it's just like this sort of like long trajectory, right? I think we have to remember those histories, especially in this moment, right? That we actually, the intersex movement in the US has like a really sort of like strong and consistent trajectory, you know, that I could look to you as a pioneer and like almost sort of like, maybe I'm like 1.5 because I'm between you and Amanda almost. My trajectory was sort of like coming out of like, you know, doing activism in college. I was involved with this organization. It was like a queer youth of color organization in New York City called Fierce. Sort of doing, working for the Gay Straight Alliance Network. I hated that place. And yeah, I think for me, like I have like a background in sort of like anti-militarism, like really sort of like organizing when, in 2003, when the US when, you know, literally started bombing Iraq, right? So for me, like I came to the intersex movement with like a sort of like, I don't know if it was a sharp analysis because I was younger, right? Like everything was kind of black and white. It was like, I'm a queer person of color, fuck you. You know, it was like, I think for me as I've developed as an activist, as a thinker, like things are really a lot more nuanced and more textured. But I think when I came to the intersex movement, I was like, I'm gonna center my experience as like a black queer person who is also intersex, who is also of trans experience. And all of those things are happening at the same time. And so for me, like what my activism has been about in the movement is sort of being like, okay, like how do we center like black people and how do we work at the intersections, right? Because I think often the intersex movement, you know, existed in a silo, like the early intersex movement. And it's not to say that there weren't people of color in the early intersex movement, but for me, you know, I was like, well, in thinking about intersex justice, like how is it in relationship to reproductive justice? How is it in relationship to disability justice, right? Like what's our relationship to trans folks, sex workers, migrant communities, like really holding that complex like analysis. So for me, that's what felt important about sort of like really pushing for intersex justice and pushing back against this narrative that intersex people of color could not, you know, bring about change, right? And do direct action and like actually center our experiences, our labor, and really sort of like be leaders in this movement. So I'll hand it off to you.
And then there's me, right? So I feel like a grandchild in a way for thinking about this generationally. I got involved in intersex advocacy work as a teenager, maybe like 12, 13 years ago, because Pigeon Pagonas handed me a flyer for Interact Youth and said, you need to join this. And I don't think myself at that age would have recognized that I'd be in this room right now sitting with these amazing folks. I want to touch on, if we're thinking about lineages, I want to touch on like how important being in community is, right? Like I think that being in community truly saved my life, and for a few reasons. Like on the one hand, I think I kind of like drank this Kool-Aid of thinking that what the clinical experiences that I had undergone were normalized, right? Were normal. And that's sort of just emblematic of the healthcare system, right? When you're a patient, you're dehumanized in this way. And it was through being in conversation with other intersex people that I really got to reframe my life. And that really, again, changed how I thought about the world, systems of power and justice. And then I also ended up meeting like queer intersex people, which was sort of like another layer to that. Something that I think Saifa touched on is that I want to expand on is that, you know, we talk about movement building within the intersex community, and it's fascinating to observe how it's really not homogenous. And we have had, like, I've served on the board of a community organization, right? And we had conversations around, you know, racial justice. We had conversations around queer inclusion where there was pushback from leadership, right? Like many of the same conversations that we have, you know, in other organizing spaces like are taking place within the intersex movement too. And sometimes I feel like incredibly jaded by this because we're intersex, like we confront like so many different like intersecting systems of oppression that how could you not like how could you like be complacent and comfortable in perpetuating these things? A lot of my work, I think, after when I first started getting involved, ended up focusing on youth. Like I was a young person, I wanted to work with like younger intersex people, and so there was this dimension of like, you know, the organization that I was working for at the time, Interact, had a youth program where the goal was to sort of like create, it's just weird to sort of like frame it this way, but to create activists, right? Like kind of like build advocacy skills within like young people When I was doing this work, I really I worked to sort of implement this framework of saying, like, listen, we're not just trying to like create people who can become activists. We want people to be able to advocate for their needs in their personal lives, right? Like whatever skills people are developing here are applicable in other areas where you constantly have to be vigilant around your needs and your safety and your boundaries. Yeah, so like it was thinking about intersex youth was kind of like where I ended up starting, and then throughout this like process, and you know when I first started getting involved, it was folks like Saifa and Emi who like really oh my god, and Cheryl, the work of ISNA, people like Hida, whose mere existence like really validated kind of some of the questions that I was having, and really helped me combat like a sense of loneliness and isolation, which still happens, right? Like I think that this is something that, you know, despite being on like group chats and having access to like different online groups, like is still, I think, like almost like a perennial question for a lot of folks. But yeah, like I was really privileged to be able to work with like other intersex young people, and I think that like, you know, I see intersex TikToks, I see intersex reels of folks that I haven't met, but who have felt empowered by like the work of Interact or like IJP or ISNA, like just coming out of the woodwork. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to think about not only the kind of trajectory of politics, but the relationships among the three of you and the kind of other folks you're bringing into the room with your comments. And I think it's really exciting to be able to take that long-term perspective. And maybe that's part of combating the isolation, is thinking about the relationships that you have all developed in creating community and creating political trends. You know, one thing that we talked a lot about in our kind of brainstorming was the role of funding and of neoliberalism, and I know that's something that you each like spent a lot of time thinking about. And you know, one of the stories that Emi, you shared when we were chatting before was the importance for you of Katrina and how that kind of really broke down your own sense of liberal idealism and kind of a progress narrative. And I was wondering if you could maybe all think a little bit about how your work on intersex kind of challenged liberal and neoliberal paradigms. I don't know if you'd be willing to share that story, Emi, of that kind of.
I don't know if it challenges it. I mean, there was, to me, like, you know, there was disconnect between doing intersex work in mostly white environment. And, you know, like in 2004, when we had like the protests at the Moscone Center at the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I saw Saifa for the first time, and I organized the protests, I made signs and things like that, and invited people, and Saifa showed up, and I was like, oh my God, there's actually a person of color who is like showing up, you know, because I was working with white people, and, you know, I mean, at the time, the thing that was really bothering me was like there are a bunch of certain patient groups of people who have specific intersex conditions, who are basically teaching each other where they can adopt cheapest children from other countries, and because they cannot make their own biological children that they were adopting. Which is fine, you know, people do all kinds of things, but then, you know, and coming from like some background, like, you know, being raised in part by like, you know, white people, that I just had this like reaction to that. People were just talking about children, like how they can get the Chinese children or Korean children or African children for cheap, basically, and that was really bothering me. And yet this is like some of the major things that these people wanted, because they are intersex, and because and especially intersex, you know, heterosexual women, to be a heterosexual woman requires having a child, and you know, in society. So I was dealing with that, and then so it was like really amazing actually. I don't know why we didn't connect more, but that was really exciting. And so there was this disconnect between like white world of doing intersex activism. Also because I was working with Intersex Society of North America, which is basically at the time the only organization that had any funding and any power anyhow. And because I represented the big national organization, which was not that big, but the biggest organization out there in the intersex world, that I can't do things that would alienate doctors too much. And so that, coming from sex worker movement, it's all about offending people, right? Sex worker and queer and all the stuff. And then suddenly I have to be nice to people and shake hands with people who are horrible people. And so there was such a disconnect around doing that. And then I think and then Iraq War started, like Saifa said. There was the Iraq War, and then there was Katrina in 2005, and just really seeing the government abandoning people and and using the disaster as a way to clear the land for other people, and and moving people around like that, and just really I was maybe government isn't doing as good a job as they could be doing, but it was there to help people was a kind of idea, and that just totally broke, and just really realizing that actually, people are actually being abandoned, certain people are not wanted by this government, and that was kind of, realization in that. And I started to question about why am I doing this intersex work? How important is it that a bunch of mostly white women are talking about their it's an important issue, but how is it compared in contrast with people being abandoned on rooftops and with no aid, and being criminalized for trying to survive, right? So started really connecting to that and really thinking about it, and it became really difficult to function in the really white world of intersex activism. So I think I stepped back from that for a while, and then just really connecting with a larger critique of, intersex is not separate from other ways bodies are regulated, and bodies are made abnormal. And because I come from disability and activism, that was really familiar to me. But I was still thinking about intersex in connection to disability in terms of analog, or as a comparison between intersex and disability, without seeing that actually disability is the racism, disability, creation of the colonized bodies is the same process as a construction of disabled bodies, or the sexually abnormal bodies that's being created. So really coming to really understanding that how the larger how the intersex work connects to other ways that the regulation of bodies in the colonialist system functions, right? So, and it's not just just intersex or trans, but women's bodies in general are made into this other category, right? So in so many ways, we're seeing so much of that, the abandonment of medical treatment for women, for one thing, So that's really connected to everything else I do, and so that's how I came back to intersex from much larger perspective. And then it's not just about change in medical protocol, but it's much bigger than that, and all the ways that the bodies are made abnormal, all the ways the bodies are ranked and hierarchized, right? So that's the kind of where I came, and I feel like now people are in like kind of crisis mode, similar to how it was in Katrina, or like right after 9/11, there was huge crisis of some people just disappearing, right? If they are like Muslims or Middle Eastern, people just disappeared, right? And then their families didn't know where they were because they were being locked up somewhere and they didn't know. And that crisis seemed to pass from a mainstream perspective, even though it's not gone. And then the Katrina, we've seen that. And then we're seeing something similar right now, the things are just breaking apart so much. And I thought that I would enjoy the US, just breaking down. But no, not like this. Right? I mean, I felt like I would be so happy if a convicted felon that could beat the prosecutor in presidential election, Yeah, because I'm totally on the side of a convicted felon over a prosecutor, but not this convicted felon.
Right.
Yeah. I'm thinking about an experience that I had where I was working on as a volunteer on this board and getting a lot of pushback. And if we're having a conversation around like neoliberal systems, you need to have like a conversation about like appeasement and like to a system and like the reproduction of like a status quo. Emi talked you touched on this like very white form of organizing, which is a very I think corporate form of organizing. We've like kind of borrowed these structures and these ideas for how we should what appropriate community organizing is and should look like, and we've transformed our community organizations into mini businesses with CEOs and all these things, right? When I was working on this board, there was a vocal need for distinct community spaces, right? Our job is to organize a community space. And there were people who felt excluded and erased and left out, namely BIPOC intersex folk and queer intersex people. And there was this idea, me and a couple other people were working on this board trying to create, carve out these spaces. And the people who had ultimate final say, again, this is this concentration of power even within an organizing group, really shut it down. So then what's the alternative? We did it ourselves, right? There's this point where you where we just said we can't work within this, so we will create our own spaces. We will and from their perspective, it was self-segregation, we were making ourselves into an other, and it's very different, I think, to sort of name that for yourself and claim that space and say, we are a part of this larger umbrella, and but we have these other unique needs, versus having someone completely try to erase you. So there's these weird dynamics that happen, and so it makes me think about how there's this need to sort of be independent, I guess, even within conventional, precisely because of conventional forms of organizing. The other thing that came to mind was this idea of recognition and visibility. Oh my God, what's his name? Jack Halberstrom, I think, has a really great lecture online on the politics of recognition and how there's certainly some, there's a lot of benefit to being recognized within civil society, but then there are also drawbacks. I have been currently really thinking a lot about what it means for both trans and gender diverse and intersex folks who have X-gender markers. That was a really important, court case for very many people, and I believe it was Dana who was an intersex person an intersex veteran in particular, who worked to advance this case. They were the ones who sued the feds. And now what we're seeing, because of an appeal to the system, now what we're seeing is backlash from that same system that ends up potentially endangering people further, right? And so there's always this, I think, this tug and pull of like, do we collaborate with folks who are, who truly don't have our best interests at heart, or like, where do we make concessions? Where do we draw the line? We often come up against this question when we're talking about like what it means to work with like healthcare providers. Who's an ally? How do we determine allyship? Like, are they gonna like advocate to the chair of their department to like actually create reforms? Do we have to like settle and be content with like crumbs or like a conference or sitting on a panel? Like, is that sufficient? No shade. Like, there's a point where I think, liberalism in this context like really thrives off of displaying people, because somehow that's enough. And if we do that, if the system does that long enough, there's no need to change. There's no requirement to like actually institute reforms. Those are my thoughts.
I just want to add the part about the Jack Halberstam's lecture or whatever. Like, it's something that the trans women of color have been saying forever.
Mm-hmm.
That this like politics, representation, and visibility, and how visibility means trans women of color get killed, right?
Whoa.
That's been like, and so like I think that's been happening like long before like Jack Halberstam.
Mm-hmm.
I flirted crazy, but he wouldn't just,
Yeah.
whatever. Anyway, but I was watching this lecture by Judith Butler, and in the question and answers, like somebody asked her, so like what's the real world, benefit of your theory? And then she just started taking credit for intersex movement.
What? Oh, that's bananas. What? Yeah. Oh, that's bananas.
I'm like, okay, you didn't even know the difference between intersex, people and like, whatever.
Yeah, like, it's funny, I mean, you were talking about, 2006, right? Because I think 2006 was like this watershed moment in the intersex movement, right? Because you had I think that was a moment at which there was this concession by intersex leaders at the time in the US to actually concede to disorders of sexual development, and that really caused a huge fracture in the international intersex community. Like it was a huge fallout, a lot of people felt very betrayed, and yeah, it's hilarious, because every opportunity I have to engage with Bo, I'm just like, let's talk about 2006 and crickets, you know what I'm saying? Crickets, Yeah, I just remember sort of coming on to the Interact board in 2012 and like really sort of being in Malta because, Interact or AIC at the time was like, okay, we're going to use the term DSD because that sort of gives us entree with the doctors, right? And yeah, it just was like, I feel like because of like the sort of US position, it was like, oh, this is our way in with the doctors. We have to use the language of DSD in order to sort of like be recognized by the medical establishment, right? And I think it sort of created the sort of pathway for, like when I remember when I went to the AIS DSD conference in 2013, and you would just see these doctors just gallivanting through the conference, taking up so much damn space. And I remember I got so mad at a presentation one of these doctors did, and he was talking crazy. And I was like, this is not okay. I was so upset, And I was just like, how is it that these doctors can have so much dominion, like, over, like, our bodies, over this space that's supposed to be a safe space for intersex people? Like, this is whack, And so for me, I was like, oh, this is not okay, And I think so much for me of like resistance and pushing back, it's sort of like, I think when me, Pigeon, and Linnell came together to form the Intersex Justice Project, it didn't really make sense to protest a children's hospital, right? Because, it's like, oh, a children's hospital, why would you protest a children's hospital? And it's like, these hospitals are sites of harm. You know what I'm saying? Like, they may seem benign, they may have the nice little teddy bears on the wall, they may have the little NICUs and the little neonatal units, but I'm like, these are sites of harm for intersex children, right? And so I think I think one thing that allowed us to say what we needed to say, to do the more like, and I mean, are any of us doing radical work in the settler colony? I don't know. I don't think so, right? But to sort of like really push back, I think because we didn't have funding. Because we didn't have that institutional funding, we were able to take more risks. So folks in this audience, if you want to fuck some shit up, if you don't have to be, accountable to foundations and all this shit, you just, then you can actually do more. I hate to say radical, because I think sometimes people slap the label on themselves. I'm like, oh, okay, boo-boo. I don't think you're really doing radical work. But, you can actually do work without bounds, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so much to think about. I mean, maybe I'll ask us to kind of come back to the question that you're already raising, Saifa, because I think it came up a lot in the conversations kind of setting up what we're going to do, which is you've all thought in really complex ways about terminology, concepts, and language, and I know everybody had some thoughts on this just because of the ways that it's fundamental language and self-description and pushing back on medical and scientific kind of terminology and taxonomies and histories has been really important to intersex politics, and I know you all have your own thoughts on this, so I thought we would open up a little bit of space for in the conversation for the limits and possibilities of language, the kind of push-pull that everyone's been navigating and kind of engaging with.
Can I open?
Please do.
Who here is on TikTok? Yeah, so many folks on TikTok. And so I'm not on TikTok actually, but the thing is like, who here has seen people with like PCOS talking on TikTok? Yes, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, that's what's up, the few times that I've been on TikTok, I've been really sort of inspired by the folks with PCOS being like, I'm intersex, and I'm like, yes. Or people with hyperandrogenism being like, I'm intersex, I'm like, yes. Because I think what often happens is that the medical establishment, especially doctors who are really committed to diminishing intersex people and intersex variations, is that they always want to collapse the category. They want intersex variations to be as small as possible. They want to say that only, you have to have these sort of characteristics, you have to have these sort of traits to be considered intersex. And one thing I really appreciate is the public dialogue around PCOS, right? Because the thing is, when you actually include people with PCOS in the intersex category, right now, they say that, intersex variations worldwide is like 2%. I mean, how the fuck do you track that? I mean, it's so arbitrary, right? But then when you include people with PCOS, it bumps it up to like 5%, right? And the thing is, if anyone, and, I was at dinner last night, and people were just saying that this generation is not having sex. So I don't want to make assumptions. I don't know. I'm not. But one thing I do want to sort of like, offer, right? If people in this room have been sexually active with more than one person, right? There is just a myriad of bodies, right? There's no one body that looks the same. So how do we know who's intersex and who's not, right? And so that's why I think it's just so important for us to really push back on this idea of like, who can be intersex and who cannot. Now, I say that with the caveat that we should always center the experiences of people who have been harmed by medical violence. We should always do that. But that doesn't always define the intersex experience, right? Because there are many people who don't have a diagnosis. There are many people who don't have access to their medical records. There are many people who have typical genitals, right? Or may have different like chromosomes or hormones, right? And there are people who haven't had corrective violent surgery, right? And so I think for me, I'm really about expanding the definition of intersex and also expanding the stories, right? Because I want to hear from people who don't identify as intersex. Like, I want to hear from people who haven't been medicalized, who haven't endured medical violence, right? Those stories are just as important as the people who have been harmed.
Yeah, I'm personally not so wedded to the term intersex anyway. I think that it's a term that, you know, was used in medicine. It's used by activists, and when the activists use it, it means something different than what the medical community does. When you know, because people who have intersex conditions or intersex people are divided into different different diagnosis categories, and the similarities and commonalities are not really seen, but only if you see it through the lens of like a medical violence that you see that those are connected. So I think that as a term of solidarity, as a term of like speaking to some of the common experiences, that was really taken up by activists as a term, and even though lots of people who might be classified as intersex don't actually like it, you know. So, and then lots of people might not identify with it, but it does speak to the kind of political community that we're seeing, and you don't have to identify as one or whatever to see that there's something to it. But also there's I think that there's a part of the title was a gender binary, and this gender binary, beyond gender binary, gives you idea that there's a stable male and stable female, and then there's something else that we're talking about that, but it's actually not like that, The male and female are not stable, and especially female is not stable, because male is defined in terms of power, and females is defined as bodies that are, that are useful to the males. So for the sexual and reproductive labor.
Right.
And then often women who don't perform those labor gets pushed out of this category of female, right? So that's why when you see when there a boundary between intersex and intersex and normal female is a lot more blurrier than between male and intersex because of that, and I think that traditionally the surgeon was talking about how it's easy to dig a hole and build a pole, was is a saying, so that if there's any question, just make them female, because females are much easier to make, because females as defined by those straight men, doctors, is basically there's a hole that can be fucked. So that's how they define it. Whereas a male body will have high standard. You have to be able to do this and this and this, and because of that, it just makes it so much easier to make those. So even this word gender binary is not real. Gender binary, we're talking about system of of the male supremacy, and anything else that falls outside of it, the people who are useful to that male supremacy gets kind of this what's called the second sex status, but then people fall out of that fairly easily if you're too old and if you cannot perform in the sexual and the reproductive functions and things like that. It's easy to fall out of that, right? So I think that to me it's not I'm not really interested in simply expanding intersex, but to really seeing that the intersex and females have much more common together than between males and females.
I will say that I love this question, and I will start with an anecdote, and then I'm going to touch on a couple things that both Emi and Saifa touched on. touched on. This one time I was at a conference, and I saw, like, you know, identity terms are complicated and probably problematic, but I saw my newfound, I guess, self on the back patch of someone who was on this at this conference. They had this like really fantastic white sleeveless denim vest, and in bright red letters on the back it said hermaphrodite, and I was like, that is it. That is it. That is everything that I am and want to be. And from that moment on, I swear to God, it changed my life. When we're having conversations about nomenclature or terminology or taxonomy, the question that comes to mind for me is, where do these terms come from? Who is creating these terms? Who is writing this narrative? Who has control? And I think that intersex people, because of our history with medicine and as being like clinical subjects, have really not been afforded the luxury to write our own identities, our own terms, right? Like, and so I think a lot about like what it means for us to have like spaces where we can get to have conversations. You know, a lot of people say that there's like, you know, that adage in community activist spaces that says our outward messaging should, which also outward messaging, Jesus Christ, but the messaging should be that we don't use the word hermaphrodite because it's taboo. And I'm like, no, that word is like centuries old, and I want to be that. Like who got together and decided that we weren't going to use that term? And it plays into this idea, you know, that Saifa brought up of collaborating, colluding with the medical scientific like complex. Like, we're going to play this game on their turf using their language because it's more respectable. Why the fuck? Like, that gives you the illusion of power, not any actual influence. And so, yeah, this is something that like keeps me up at night. Is like, how do we get to like name ourselves? I am currently working on a research project that's all about trying to create inclusive measures within queer community public health. And you know, if you're talking about measures in science, you're talking about the complexities of again identity terms. And when we have these conversations around like intersex in particular, I think that like it's really hard to sort of create, you know, a measure, for example, that says we're going to capture intersex people, but then you might end up excluding people who don't use intersex as a key identifier, or people who think of themselves as like a man or a woman with a medical condition. And there's a lot of gray area there that I think that we inherited, that I think comes from like a really violent history. And so, as Saifa said, you know, when we have folks with PICOs who are saying, hey, I think I'm intersex, I'm gonna opt into this term. I'm like, hell yeah, you are, because like that's you reclaiming that, and like that you're not playing the game according to like some like endocrinologist or some researcher. You're doing that for yourself, and you're finding community on top of that. Now, can it be a little divisive, like within the discourse? Yeah, there are like, I know people who are like, no, we need to exclude the PICOS folks because that's not us. And I'm like, bro, like, listen, you like, who put you in charge, right? Like, and so ultimately, like, these are, gosh, I really want to challenge folks to think about like what intersex means in this context of like, you know, of control. Like that to me is, I think, a huge challenge and a huge question that like we think about, I think, a lot, and I think all of you all here should as well.
You know, I think that in different ways you are interested in thinking about the antagonism of the present moment it's come up in a few threads that have been raised, like around the regulation of bodies, bodily autonomy, and I'm just wondering what kinds of connections you're seeing, both with thinking about the kind of regulation of bodies, and for example, Roe versus Wade, I know we chatted about the other day, connections between trans and intersex politics and movements, what kinds of solidarities this can kind of create. So I guess maybe the question is a little bit about bodily autonomy, like what kinds of connections do you see in thinking about the kind of restrictions that are put on bodies? And then the other could be solidarity that created through that, or other kinds of solidarities we talked about.
Letters, writing comments on bills where, you know, we talk about defending trans youth access to gender-affirming care and the impact that these bills have on the trans community. Those same bills, those same orders are going to have ripple effects that end up impacting intersex people too. And so it's on the one hand, I'm observing this, like, you know, erasure at, like, in a political sense, but I'm also kind of seeing folks like leave us out of the conversation. Don't really know why, but that is concerning in and of itself. And I think that in a conversation around advocacy, like in my work at least, like I mean, the sense here is like we're all queer, so we do that in our work as well, but we advocate in a way that is also inclusive of other communities, and it's sometimes is just frankly a little sad to sort of not see that returned. This is just like my observations. I know that there are like folks who like, and organizations and other advocates who like do and really intentionally include intersex within their own conversations. But it's not ubiquitous, and I feel like it's like very few folks, it's like few and far between, right? So I think that like continuing to talk about like intersex existence and all of the interesting and like complicated topics that brings up is vital. It's just vital. Yeah. Well, what do you think?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the erasure, aka eugenics, you know, we're talking about eugenics. We're talking about the long history of, you know, like I said earlier, about how the bodies are disabled, how the bodies are even like, you know, people saying that, you know, some of the scientific racism arguing that the, you know, different races come from different species, even that you know, because of their mental capacity, certain races can only be happy as slave and enslaved, and that you know, if they seek freedom, that's a mental illness. It's like how the you know, disability and race are really connected, and how the, you know, people of certain races are, you know, their sexualities are in question, their sexual aggression as well as their sexual promiscuity are, you know, considered, and those are like where bodies are raised in sex and disabled at the same time, right? And sometimes that's useful to the production that can be, you know, managed as laborers. And other times it's a target for erasure, aka eugenics, right? And another synonym for this that we talked about during the conversation earlier is cisness. So cisness is not simply opposite of trans. Right. It's a fundamental, you know, principle in the system of producing normal and abnormal bodies, and, you know, and erasing it. And I think that we think of intersex as just naturally occurring, you know, abnormalities, but we make abnormalities out of like nature, right? And not just in terms of intersex, but, you know, and not just trans. So cisness is not just about, you know, not trans. It's not just about trans people and trans rights, or intersex, you know, people and intersex rights, but it's what, you know, it's much bigger than that. It's something that, you know, creates the normalized bodies race, sex, and able, disabled bodies, right? So that's really all connected, and I think that in the past few years there has been lots of improvement in terms of trans rights, and people saw that until this administration happened, there were improvements in different ways, policy wise, and people started to think okay, you are because I accept trans people and respect people's gender pronouns and their gender identities and their chosen names, so therefore I'm good. And that's kind of a complacency that we've been in, without realizing that cisness is not just about trans people, but it's about everybody. It's about the and how that as long as that kind of a diversity and DEI blah 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 is beneficial to the corporations, they will take advantage of that. And then how quickly they will rescind it.
Ooh,
right?
So quick.
How quickly that they would just give it up and throw it away and erase our existence from, and it's not just intersex or trans existence or queer existence, it's just so many people are being erased right now. And right now it's just being erased from the government websites, but our physical existence is also going to be erased. First targeting immigrants, but other people are going to be facing that, right? So that's the kind of moment we're in, and I've been just reading about how the dictatorships have ended and how the authoritarianism have fallen and things like that. They fall, they die eventually, So it's going to pass. But we want to make sure that as many of us can survive through that and not be erased, right? And then not just surviving in terms of physically alive, but to be able to live, right? So so I think that we really need to think of it not just as an issue for this specific group of people, but much larger system, how all this is connected, and so and I think that we need to think about the cisness as much bigger than what it's made to be. People often just define cisness, being cis, as your gender identity and your gender, your sign matches your gender and you identify as. That's such a narrow definition. That doesn't really tell you the kind of powers and how the cisness is about system. It's about power. And it's saying white people are people from Europe who have pale skin. It doesn't tell you anything about why whiteness actually matters.
Listen,
right?
Come on, Emi. Come on.
So yeah.
Yeah, I really love that segue, Emi, because I think it's just so important to just call a team. We are living in fascism. The U.S. is fascist. Has always been fascist.
Fire alarm is gonna come on.
I know, right? You know who? And when I was in England, I was, I sort of was seeing how, for example, with second wave feminism, there was a feminist, Ann Oakley, right, who totally loved what John Money was saying, right? She was just oh my God, yes, sex is separate from gender. But totally used that for the benefit of feminism without mentioning the harm that intersex people were facing because of Money's practices. That is a classic example, right? And so I just feel for me, in this moment, I think it's really important for us to see that there's an anti-gender movement, right? And I think, part of sort of U.S. American exceptionalism is that we don't want to admit that what happened on January 6th was an attempted coup d'etat, right? We don't want to think of ourselves, we want to think of ourselves as a democracy, but we're not a democracy, right? And I think we have to be very honest about that. I think Trump just reveals more of who we are, but the thing is all of the US presidents are fucking war criminals. They're terrible, you know what I'm saying? And so I think more than anything else now, I think we have to make those connections. And I think, I really like what you said about bodily autonomy, because I think people are just like, well, as long as it's not happening to me or my community, I'll be fine, right? There were people I know, right? When the anti-trans healthcare bans were happening, they were like, you know what? Yeah, they shouldn't be giving young people hormones. Yeah, I'm like, excuse me, like, what? People who I knew had like trans friends, and these same people knew nothing about intersex people. I was like beating the drum, being like, there are intersex exceptions, and they're like, oh wow, that sucks. I'm just like, my God, right? And it's just like, we're just not, I think this country should have came to a standstill when Roe versus Wade was knocked down, right? When the anti-trans healthcare bans were happening, this country should have came to a standstill. When the first bomb dropped on, Al-Ahi Hospital in Gaza, this country should have came to a standstill. Right? And so the thing is, I just feel like we're like frogs, boiling, right? And the thing is, what I know to be true and what I feel to be true is that when actually the conditions will get so bad that when people actually rise up, then you have cop cities waiting to contain people, to detain people, and to execute people, right? And so the thing is it's I think we have to be very real about the conditions in which we're existing to really see that all of our issues are interrelated, right? Because I think operating in silos are not going to be beneficial for us in the long run. And when I first came into Seattle, me and Amanda was so kind and so gracious to take me to the WTO exhibit. I forgot Mohai. And
it's
what
amazing.
it is amazing. But what was so dope about it is that what made that possible is that you had people from different corners, right? Everyone was working independently, but people were working together. That was fucking brilliant, and they shut that shit down, right? And the thing is that's the kind of energy we need, across this motherfucking country. Because I think also there's a belief that when the shit goes down, it's okay, Seattle, oh, they're gonna do that. Oakland, oh, they're gonna do that. Chicago, yeah, they're gonna do that, right? And then it's sort of this sort of activism in these liberal centers. But the thing is, it has to be where's the through line? Where's the continual conversations that happen all across this country? It's not enough for action to be happening in these liberal centers. That's not enough, right? So yes.
I'm getting chills here. Okay. Now, to I think extend what you're talking about now, one thing that everyone on the panel wants to talk about that maybe we can close with is some of your ideas for the future. We talked about that in planning for the event. And here's two questions that you pose and I'm quoting here from y'all that just I'm posing back to you, which is, what would a future that is hospitable to intersex people look like? And or you shared both of these. How do we ensure that our people continue to thrive and not just survive in this regime? Just small questions. Small things to think about.
Well, as a person with a rising Aquarius, I love to dream and to hope and to share my vision, right? Those are big questions. Mm-hmm. And I don't have any answers. And I'm skeptical of people who do have answers in this moment. Because I'm just listen, if you have lived through a fascist dictatorship, or if you have survived the coup, or if your people have survived genocide, then you can talk to me. That's who I want to hear from. But if you got the think piece in the debates, no, you ain't talking. I don't want to hear it, I think for me, there's something around repair, right? I just feel as a person of African descent, this country has not given my people reparations, we have built this nation. And I think there's something about repair. I think there's something about restorative justice. You know, I think it's something to be said that there were the survivors of, what was it? The Black Wall Street. Tulsa.
Yes.
Tulsa. You know, there were survivors. They were like over 100 years old. They were survivors. They were witnesses to the Tulsa massacre. And they still were like, no. Oklahoma was like, no. You know? And so for me, like, I feel that I want to see a world in which people can be proud of the bodies that they inhabit, right? Maybe we won't even have a need to be intersex, right? There will just be a recognition that people are born all kinds of ways, and they fall somewhere along the spectrum that could be male or female, right? And I want that people who have been harmed, that there is justice, there is reparations, there is free health care. I want to see the prosecution of doctors. I want to see them motherfuckers go to jail. Even though, you know, I like to consider myself, I don't consider myself an abolitionist. But I feel like the people who have caused harm, I think there needs to be accountability for the people who have caused harm. Because there are people who are urologists who are psychopaths, who are rapists, who are pedophiles. And they should not be able to practice medicine, you know? And so for me, you know, I feel like there has to be repair. And yeah, that's what I want.
Thank you for these gigantic questions.
I was echoing them back.
Such a short amount of time to solve them. I think the main thing, I want to echo what Saifa said, like, first and foremost. And I'm also not going to pretend to have the answers, and I'm also just one person who is a person. What I feel like I do know with certainty, is that if we're going to ensure a future with intersex people, we have to fight for intersex people today. Like, that is, like, baseline. And a part of that is, like, you know, definitely, like, gosh, I mean, it feels like the same kind of things where call your senators, but also call your grandma, you know, like, maybe she needs to know about this too. Reach out to your friend and ask, like, yo, when did you last, like, do you want to grab coffee or dinner? Seattle's really good at that. And then on top of that, I also, like, think that a point I want to, like, get back to is that, like, appealing to biomedicine isn't going to save us. I think that, like, I'm really, really skeptical and critical of, like, what it means to have conversations around, like, biological sex and trying to litigate and legislate around that. It seems to be the case that, like, if you want to be, like, protected, you need to, like, be federally recognized, and that is potentially true, but there needs to be a lot of, like, care and approach to thinking about, like, what that means. I think that, like, I'm taking notes, and so there was, like, a point that I wanted to make on top of that. Excuse me for 1 second. Oh, right. Biological sex has been, like, a moving target for the past 120 years. Like, and it's not only is it a moving target, it's a moving goalpost. So, like, anyone who makes, like, any form of argument around where you're trying to base it fully in science, you're, again, like, playing that game. You're playing on their turf. And there needs to be recognition that the fact that we exist, period, is sufficient in and of itself. That is why we should have rights. Not because we, you know, mystify, like, the human experience, or because we problematize, like, a sex binary. Like, maybe those things are true, sure, but I think that the existence of any queer person undermines all of those systems. And like intersex people like have rights just because we exist, period.
Yeah, I think that what Amanda said about like, you know, supporting each other and with people that we're connected to is really important. I think that, you know, I mean, if you know, those of you who are not facing like some existential threat right now, and then your friends are okay, your family is okay, then you can actually step outside of that and try to support the people who need that more, you know, now, because there's so much going on, right? And I think, you know, I mean, I feel so old, but like, you know, I'm, you know, but, you know, 2020 was, you know, you were around in 2020 and you saw the Black Lives Matter movement just, you know, rise up and the whole, like, you know, but it didn't happen just because somebody took a video of George Floyd being killed, you know. I mean, that was part of it, but also because there was organizing long before that. In a quiet time during the first Trump administration, where you know, there were a lot of, you know, like black people being killed by the police all over the country, more black people and more people of color being killed for like other ways, you know, either slowly or through like you know, violence, right? And there was lots of organizing. And locally in Seattle, there are several ordinances that was changed as a result of 2020 uprising. There were some of the public buildings that were basically given away to the community organizations, and as part of like trying to support black communities in Seattle. And there are some changes concrete changes that happened in 2020, but none of them happened because of that, you know, one summer, right? It happened because people were organizing for that long before that. I was myself involved in like one of the laws around, you know, city ordinance around the prostitution loitering law, and trying to get it to change and trying to abolish that, because prostitution loitering law was basically anybody who looks like they're doing prostitution, so they're doing like racial and gender profiling against the women who are working, women of color, young women of color who are walking around in certain areas. And so we're trying to stop that, and then city council agreed with that, but they didn't do anything for like many years. And then finally in June 2020, they just like suddenly decided that was a good idea to do it, because people were so angry and people were out there every day, and they needed something to like throw at us, right? But because we've been organizing around it, they already had the plan on the shelf, that they weren't looking at it at all, but it was there. And then when the moment came, it happened. Now they actually reversed this change like last year in the city council, because now Seattle City Council is like ridiculously conservative. I don't understand it, like why it's so horrible right now, but. So it's something that we always, you know, even when you don't see anything in the news, or even when, you know, when there's no like a huge movement of people, like things are happening, right? And then we really need that for the right moment to come. And the moment's going to come, it comes and goes, right? Nobody thought that the, you know, Black Lives Matter movement is going to continue forever to be this dominant. You know, it was shorter than we wanted, much shorter. But, you know, but it comes and goes, like a kind of moment comes and goes, and we need to be ready when it happens. And it could be, you know, it could be next month, or it could be like, you know, a couple of years later. It could be like, you know. But we need to be there and ready and have a plan of getting things changed, right? So I think we need to maintain our communities, maintain our friendships, maintain our relationship with people, and then step a little bit outside of that, so you connect with people that you don't otherwise have connection to, right? And then be ready. And not everybody can just like go and, you know, people are risking so much if they go and protest, especially if you're an immigrant or trans or whatever, right? Or if you need medicine to survive, like, you know, you really don't want to end up in jail, right? so that those of you who can risk that more can do more, right? So yeah, I think that we really need to have that, people need to step up right now. And even if it's just to support your family and friends, and then people who may not be friends, but people who share a space with you, who share streets with you, right? So yeah.
And just one thing I want to add on to what Emi said, don't settle for representation. BLM was founded in 2014 under the Obama administration. Like, we had a black ass president and black people still getting murdered by the police. So do not settle for representation.
Yes, so yeah, thank you. This is, I think, a good place for us to end up. Words of wisdom, important strategies, real important guidance from history to the present to the future. We came a long way, so thank you so much to the panelists for being with us today for these conversations.